Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. My name is Russell Brooks. Tonight's show will focus on an interesting piece of presidential history. We all know that Harry Truman was Franklin Roosevelt's final vice president. They ran together in the 1944 campaign, FDR's fourth. FDR died in April 1945 before the end of World War II, making Harry Truman the 33rd President of the United States. What is less well known is how that ticket came together and why. To offer insight into those questions, we have tonight's guest, Dr. James Curry, the author of the book, Missouri Mule, How Harry Truman's Stubbornness and Determination Helped Win World War II and Led Him to the Presidency. Dr. Curry, welcome to Inside Scoop.
Thank you so much, Russell. Delighted to be here.
Well, we are certainly glad to have you. Let's begin with a little bit about your background. Take a few moments to tell the audience about your career, both academic and military.
I'd start by saying that I'm a historian and I consider myself a writer. I was commissioned into the U.S. Army through the ROTC program at the University of Virginia, where I was in graduate school. I attended UVA and got my PhD in history from the University of Virginia. I've taught at various colleges and universities. Most notably, I spent 18 years teaching at one of the Defense Department's war colleges, as they call it, at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. I taught at several schools in Mississippi, which was my home state, including Jackson State University, one of the HBCUs and one of the great black universities in our country. I have always enjoyed education and consider myself an educator. So when I set out to do this exploration, I will call it, of Harry Truman and the Truman Committee, my goal was to provide answers to things that had not previously been addressed, and I think you did a very good job of setting that up for us in your introduction.
Now, you also worked in the U.S. Senate. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
I did. I worked first of all for a year as a staffer for the U.S. House of Representatives. I was actually a historian for the U.S. House of Representatives. I then moved over to the U.S. Senate, and I worked primarily for a senator from Texas named Lloyd Bentsen, a Democrat, who was the vice presidential nominee in 1988. I was Senator Bentsen's speechwriter, and I did his defense and foreign policy work for him, and I was also his representative on the Select Committee on Intelligence in the Senate. And a lot of what I learned while I was working for Senator Bentsen appears in the book that I wrote, and the one that you mentioned. It helped me understand the way the Senate operated during the time that Harry Truman was in it, because what I discovered was that the rules of the Senate had not changed that much from the 1940s to the 1980s when I was there. And the lessons that I learned working there in the Senate in the 1980s were quite applicable to understanding the Senate of Harry Truman's time.
Now that we know a bit about you, what led you to write this book about President Truman?
My dad was a World War II bomber pilot. He was 19 years old. He was in the National Guard. He was a college student, and his National Guard unit was federalized, that is, taken to federal service. He was a tuba player in the National Guard band, and he saw war going on in Europe, and he decided he didn't want to go through it as a tuba player, so he volunteered to go out to Texas and learn to fly airplanes. He was on his 19th mission flying his bomber when he was shot down after dropping bombs on the oil fields and refineries at Ploiești, Romania. He was captured by the Romanians along with his entire crew and was put in prisoner of war camp. But he served honorably and he served well in World War II. There were 16.5 million people who put on the uniform of our country during World War II and helped us defeat the Nazis and the Japanese. And my book is dedicated to the memory of my dad specifically and to those other 16.5 million people who served in uniform. And the story that I wanted to tell was that, at least in the form of Harry Truman, there was one very high-ranking United States senator who was interested in their well-being and in giving them the tools they needed to fight the war and in protecting our country against being exploited, I will say, by those who were turning out the millions and billions of dollars worth of war material we used. So I started this book with the idea that I would tell the story of who was there to help those men and women who were serving in uniform and giving up so much in doing so.
Now let's turn to the book. Many in our audience may not be familiar with Harry Truman's political biography. Is it fair to say that he was a product of maybe a less than honorable political machine in the state of Missouri?
That is definitely understating it. Harry Truman was first elected to a position in Missouri they called a county judge. In this area, we would call it a member of the Board of Supervisors. But he was only elected because the members of the most corrupt political machine in his area of Missouri decided that Truman would make a good candidate, so they supported him. Truman himself never did anything corruptly. He was never charged with anything. He never was even suspected of doing anything bad. But when he first got elected to the United States Senate, which was with the help of this political machine, there were many members of the Senate who didn't want to have anything to do with him. They thought he was tainted, and they thought that they shouldn't make him a full colleague of theirs. They soon got over that, I think, but the fact that he was tainted by his associations with the Pendergast machine is reflected in what I will call magisterial book that David McCullough wrote. It's a biography called Truman. It's 1,000 pages long, and it won the Pulitzer Prize for him in 1993. One of his chapters is called The Senator from Pendergast.
Very interesting. So it might also be fair to say that Harry Truman was not expected to be one of the leading lights of the Senate.
That is understating it. It definitely is the case. In 1940 and even into 1941, Truman was what you would call a backbench senator. He was little known. He wasn't even the best known senator from Missouri at the time, and having that association with the Pendergast machine did not help him. He overcame that by chairing this Truman Committee that I write about in the book. And I can talk at length about what the Truman Committee did. But he went from being an unknown and actually on Franklin Roosevelt's political bad list, I will call it, his doghouse. Because in 1940, when Harry Truman announced that he was going to run for re-election to the U.S. Senate, he had a press conference in St. Louis. And at that press conference, he threw in the line, and I'm going to run for re-election, but I don't think President Roosevelt ought to run for a third term, and because no president has ever done that before. And I can only imagine how the White House reacted to having a sitting United States Democratic senator, a New Deal supporter like Truman, say that about the president and his campaign. So the fact that less than 3.5 years later, Franklin Roosevelt practically begs Truman to join him on the ticket in 1944 is the main theme of my book, and that's what I can talk about a little bit if you want to. But in 1940 and 1941, nobody had Truman on their list of potential vice presidential candidates for the 1944 election.
Okay, so you title your book Missouri Mule. How did you come up with that title?
Several people in Truman's life and in his career referred to Truman as being one of the stubbornest people they had ever met. And I actually grew up around mules. I grew up in Mississippi, kind of out from the town, and there were mules all around me. I never rode one, I never owned one, but I knew about them. And they are one of the stubbornest creatures you would ever find. So when I was trying to come up with what I thought would be a catchy title for this particular book, I hit upon the idea of the Missouri Mule as epitomizing what Harry Truman really was down deep inside, a stubborn and determined man. And I don't think anybody who knew him would ever say he didn't display those two qualities.
And were those qualities necessary in order to be the head of this commission that was looking into practices by, I guess, what was the military-industrial complex of that time.
That is precisely what it was. It was a gigantic complex. Franklin Roosevelt referred to it as making us the arsenal of democracy. And the amount of money that we spent on World War II staggers the imagination. By 1944, we were spending 40% of our GDP on the military.
That's incredible.
That is a huge amount to spend. We were spending so much money that one man who testified before the Truman Committee said he was a Navy contractor, and he said if there hadn't been for taxes, we couldn't have handled our profits with a steam shovel. And that was exactly the case. So Truman went into this effort to, first of all, make sure that the men and women who were fighting the war on our behalf had the material they needed to successfully prosecute the war, and second, to see to it that the American taxpayers were not ripped off by these companies. And some of the greatest corporations in our country, some of the largest, I will say at least, were routinely probably stealing millions and millions of dollars from the federal government because nobody was looking over their shoulders. The Truman Committee at its peak had about 30 people on it, including all the staff, and they had 7 senators who were on it, Democrats and Republicans. It was a very bipartisan committee. And they couldn't possibly look into anything. So what I've done in my book is pick out several cases where the Truman Committee did get involved in this military-industrial complex and show it up and show the American people what was going on and create outrage, I will say, about what was happening, and even referred some people to the Justice Department for prosecution. That is, members of private corporations.
Did anyone go to jail?
There were people who went to jail. They weren't the people at the top. They were able to get away with it, as often happens. Yes. But some of the lower ranking people did actually go to jail as a result of the Truman Committee actions. Some of the military officers that they recommended for court-martial were put in the penitentiary after that as well. So they tried to have accountability for all of this money that was being spent from the American taxpayer to prosecute this war.
Well, that's a novel concept, accountability. Well, we're going to have to pause our conversation with Dr. James Curry, for a short break. Please stay tuned when we return with more Inside Scoop.
Okay, so we drowned the fire, stirred it, drowned it again, and now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. Already posted it.
I got a crick in my neck, limp in my step, cramping in my muscles every time I try to flex. That I was scared of. It's very sad all that I could do was remember you. You know I usually say no, but if you throw me love, I'll throw you some more.
It's a big responsibility.
Oh, it's huge. I know, it's huge.
And the salary.
Oh my god, yes.
Right?
I mean, like, I was about to move in with my parents, and right before, so this saved me.
I really believe in you, you know?
Thank you. It's nice to hear that from someone.
These are cool. Did you, what did you?
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
I'm Russell Brooks, joined by my guest, Dr. James Curry, the author of Missouri Mule, How Truman's Stubbornness and Determination Helped Win World War II and Led Him to the Presidency. Let's continue. We left off the previous segment describing how Harry Truman emerged as this unexpected force in the Senate. And that came about because he led the, quote, Special Committee of the Senate to investigate the National Defense Program, yes. The Truman Committee.
Yes.
Again, why was the committee created and what was it charged to do?
There's an interesting story there. After he got reelected to the Senate in November of 1940, Truman started getting letters from his constituents in Missouri, particularly talking about the development of a fort in Missouri that became known as Fort Leonard Wood. Mm-hmm. And they were telling Truman that the people who were building it didn't know what they were doing and they were wasting time and material and money. And Truman was a very stingy guy. He really put his finger on the taxpayers' money and dollars and said, I don't want that wasted. So Truman did in 1940 what no other senator would have done at that time, and certainly nobody would have done today. He got in his car by himself and drove 10,000 miles around the eastern half of the United States, going to all of the new forts and air bases and cantonments that were being erected in preparation for our getting into World War II. He didn't tell anybody he was coming. He didn't indicate that he was coming to visit them. He just showed up on their doorsteps. Wow. And he would go up and park his car and get out and walk around and talk to the workmen and talk to the foreman and say, how are you doing and what's going on and do you need anything and can we help you at all? I'm a U.S. Senator and I'm here to learn from you. And he got away with that and he spent weeks doing this and finally drove back home and decided, I need to tell somebody about this. So the first person he told was the Secretary of War. And Truman wrote up a report and took it to the secretary and said, this is what I've discovered in these places that the Army's building. And then he went to President Franklin Roosevelt and he said, Mr. President, this is what I've found out. And we need to do something about that. And Roosevelt, of course, agreed with him because, you know, he wouldn't disagree with him on something like that. So then Truman said, well, I'm going to make a speech to the Senate and I'm going to tell my fellow senators about what I found. And he got to talking to a newspaper reporter from Missouri, a man he knew. And the reporter said to him, well, Senator, if all you do is make a speech, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to change. What you need to do is to suggest the creation of a special committee to investigate all of this stuff that's going on, because we're not even in the war at this point, and the money that we're spending now is going to look small compared to what we spend in the future. So if you suggest that the Senate set up this special committee, and you just quoted the name of it as it was officially called, you will undoubtedly be named chairman of it.
Interesting. So Truman didn't have the idea to establish the committee. No. Someone suggested it to him.
A reporter suggested it to him.
Quite different than what we would expect today.
Yes.
When I dare say the average senator would have been looking for an opportunity
yes.
to make his presence known.
Well, interesting thing is there had been some other members of Congress who had suggested something similar even earlier, even the year before. There was a senator on the Republican side named Arthur Vandenberg, who was a very anti-New Deal Republican from Michigan, as I recall. And Senator Vandenberg proposed that they set up a special committee to investigate all this defense buildup, but he was a Republican. And the Democrats controlled the Senate, and they were not going to let a Republican chair a committee to investigate President Roosevelt's defense buildup. So it didn't go anywhere. And there was a congressman from Georgia, and I think you'll get as big a kick out of his name as I did. His name was Edward Eugene, nicknamed Goober Cox, from Georgia. And he was a Democrat, but he was an anti-New Deal Democrat who hated President Roosevelt. And Goober Cox suggested the creation of a joint committee to to investigate the defense buildup. And he actually put a resolution in the House of Representatives about a month before Truman's resolution was put in the Senate. But
Joint committee being House and
a joint
Senate?
committee meaning that it would have House and Senate members on it, and it would have 2 co-chairs. Joint committees, there are some on the Hill now, and there were a few of them back then, but they never worked very well. And nobody who's ever studied Congress much, and I feel like I'm one of those people who studied it, ever thinks a joint committee works very well for an investigative purpose.
And also, isn't one of the problems that ordinarily senators and members of the House don't exactly get along all that well?
They don't. They have entirely different ways of looking at things, and the Senate and House operate so differently. For example, in the Senate of Truman's day and in the Senate of today, any senator can bring up a bill and offer it. Now, they may not get it to the floor if the majority leader doesn't want it to come to the floor, but they have the privilege of doing that. In the House of Representatives, the Speaker controls everything. They did in Truman's day, and they do today. And the Speaker in Truman's day was a man named Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker for a very long time. Sam Rayburn was an ardent New Deal supporter. He was a big supporter of President Roosevelt, and he was not going to let Goober Cox get his resolution to the floor unless Roosevelt said, okay, you can bring it up if you want to.
Sure. Now, committees established. How successful was this committee?
I would call it one of the most incredibly successful investigating committees the Senate has ever had. And there have been a number of scholars who have studied it and reported on it and said exactly that same thing. David McCullough, in his book, lauds this committee and points out the good that it did. The committee spent a total of $360,000 in then dollars, 1944 dollars, let's say. And the estimates are that it saved the American taxpayer between $6 billion and $15 billion in 1944 money. So for that alone, it's successful. The other thing it did was that it put the fear of the Senate into some of these defense contractors who were cheating the government and sending in substandard equipment. And my book talks about those episodes of the contractors and what they were doing to the taxpayers and to the war fighters. And it just really teed off Truman. Truman was a World War I combat veteran. His National Guard unit had served in combat in Europe, and he'd stayed in the reserves after that and risen to the rank of full colonel. And Truman really cared for the men and women in uniform, and he wanted to give them the best possible material to fight the war.
Now, in addition to the corporate interests that probably were not all that pleased by the establishment of this committee, I have to imagine that there was some institutional opposition within the government itself. Specifically, I'm thinking about the Department of the Army at that time and the Navy. There was no Air Force at that time.
Yeah.
So how did the generals and admirals feel about the intrusion of the Senate committee?
They did everything they could in many instances to keep the committee from doing its work. They kept using terms like military exigency and military necessity and military security and national security and all of those
familiar.
things. Yeah, it sounds very familiar because they still do it today. And they did not want this investigative committee looking over their shoulders at what they were doing and the way they were spending the taxpayers' money. They wanted to be like that guy that I mentioned earlier. They wanted to spend the money like it was no tomorrow, and that they could do anything they wanted to with it, and that the spigot would never be turned off or even turned down. So there was that aspect of it. The other part of it was there were people in the Roosevelt administration who didn't like what Truman was doing. The president himself never really expressed his opposition to Truman because Truman was true on his word. He never did anything much, I say, to embarrass the president. But there were other people in cabinet level positions who weren't real thrilled about having Truman investigate the things that they were doing.
Sure. What type of press coverage did the Truman and the committee receive?
That was the key. Before Truman's committee got into it, no committee that I have been able to find in the United States Senate ever had individuals specifically designated to work with the press. Now that sounds bizarre today, but I talked with one of the historians for the United States Senate when I was doing my research, and I said, did Senate offices have press spokespeople in those days? And he said, no. Everybody in there, they may have had one lawyer, but the rest of them were clerks, and none of them dealt with the press. And Truman used the press because he wanted to get public support behind what his committee was doing. And in doing so, he took himself from being that backbench, unknown, slightly tainted U.S. senator to being the best known United States senator across the country. And that was how he used the press.
Now, today, any politician with any type of positive national press would start testing the waters for a presidential campaign. What was it like in the 1940s?
Harry Truman said consistently, every time anybody asked him, do you want to run for vice president? No, I want to stay in the Senate. I'm not interested in running for vice president. But even his own staff looked at Truman and said, this is a man who is positioning to be the vice president of the United States. I don't draw a conclusion in my book as to whether Truman really wanted to stay in the Senate or whether he actually was saying all of these things that you'd say when you don't want to be considered for vice president. He was the man who became the essential person for President Roosevelt's campaign in 1944. All of Roosevelt's political advisors told the president, Harry Truman is the one person you can put on your ticket who will bring votes to the ticket and help strengthen the ticket. Nobody else will do that. But Roosevelt didn't even, like I said, he didn't even like Truman very much. Roosevelt, I would say, was probably the most class-conscious president we had in the 20th century. He was a very wealthy man, and he was a very educated man. He was a lawyer, and Truman had never finished anything more than high school. So the very idea that you would take a man like that and put him in the second most powerful position in our country was anathema to Roosevelt, I would say, and he resisted having Truman on the ticket for the longest time. He led other people along, and he finally practically begged Truman to join him on the ticket in 1944.
It is time for another short break, so please stay tuned as we continue our conversation when we return with more Inside Scoop.
Old man Hennessy's window.
Correction, dude. You broke. I just threw the ball.
This is really bad. What are we gonna do?
We?
Go to the door, ask for the ball back. Are you serious?
It's my ball, Myrtleback.
You're so dead.
I'd run away.
Yeah, to Uruguay.
Kiss your life goodbye. Sorry.
Let's go.
Dad.
See ya, dude. See ya. Remember me and your well.
Nice life. Some friends you are.
Hi. Tell him it was an accident. And we can fix the window. Come on. I'll come with you.
Loyalty. Pass it on.
You go first.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's a matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about free nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Yeah.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Awkward. I'm the awkward silence. You try to avoid me, then there I am again.
But an awkward silence can be a great thing.
Like Kelly here is about to demonstrate.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health
at seizetheawkward.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
I'm Russell Brooks, joined by tonight's guest, the author of Missouri Mule, Dr. James Curry. The book concerns the rise of Harry Truman, our 33rd president. Let's continue. So we've established FDR was not necessarily a fan of Harry Truman. Truman didn't support FDR's run for a third term. FDR didn't support Truman's run for re-election to a second term in the Senate. Now, of course, all this occurred before the 1944 campaign, but it's hard to imagine that there was not any bad blood between the two men. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure there was any blood at all between them, bad or otherwise, to tell you the truth. But you're absolutely right. In 1940, Truman made the statement that he thought Roosevelt shouldn't run for a third term. Well, I don't know exactly, nobody's ever recorded what Roosevelt exactly said in the White House, but I'm certain we couldn't repeat it on television regardless. And the fact was, Roosevelt did not endorse Truman's reelection, which is kind of unusual not to endorse in a primary a man who supported the New Deal 99% of the time. And Truman was a big supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, but I think that episode where Truman said that Roosevelt shouldn't run for the third term really ticked off Roosevelt. Roosevelt even tried to bribe Truman to drop out of the primary by offering him a commissioner's seat on the Interstate Commerce Commission, which paid a lot more than a U.S. senator's seat paid.
That's interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, this was a flat-out bribe that was totally illegal. And you know, if they'd been trying to enforce the law, they probably would have found something. But this was Franklin Roosevelt, so he got away with it. And Roosevelt didn't really believe that Truman would be, I would say, a worthy successor to him as president. And Truman probably had doubts in his own mind about his ability to be president. As I think I mentioned, he only had a high school education. He had learned a lot of things outside of high school. Truman was an incredible reader. He read books voraciously. He was self-taught in terms of American history, and he knew so much more about the history of our country than most of the other senators did. By serving as chair of this committee, he worked one-on-one with the highest levels in our government, the cabinet officials, the military generals and admirals, and he learned that he could stand up to them and be just as good as they were, even though he didn't have perhaps the credentials that some of them had. So when Truman was put up as a candidate in 1944, he had something going for him that all of the other people mostly didn't have, who were primary contestants in that. Truman always had the support in Missouri of the black community, because for his time he was very enlightened in terms of rights for black people. Truman was not, I would say he was not flawless. He used what we call the N-word, which a lot of people did back then. And but Truman believed in equal political rights for black people, and he said that. He was from what I would call a quasi-Southern state, and yet he voted for federal anti-lynching statutes, which other senators from around him did not do. Truman also was supported by the Jewish community in Missouri. His business partner was a man named Eddie Jacobson, who was a Jew, who had fought with Truman in World War I. And they rose and fall together. They went bankrupt together in the haberdashery that they ran. And Truman was also supported by organized labor in Missouri and elsewhere. He was a very strong proponent of organized labor. And that, I think, reflects Truman's background as what I would call a genuine populist. He believed, unlike the fake populist we have sometimes today, he really believed in the value of the ordinary person. And Truman believed in helping to support them and helping do things that would help make their life better. So when it came time to looking at candidates in 1944, Truman had this incredible record that he and his committee had created, working with the news media, being on the cover of Reader's Digest, being on the cover of Time magazine, doing nationwide radio broadcasts, answering all the letters from the people who wrote into his committee. He was a modern day U.S. Senator, 40 years ahead of his time, I would say. And therefore, when they started looking for a likely running mate for Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, he was the man who ticked off all the qualities that they were looking for. That's from Roosevelt's political advisors, that is. Roosevelt still didn't want him.
But why did Roosevelt need another vice president? He had one?
Yes.
Henry Wallace?
Yes.
What was wrong with Henry Wallace? Why couldn't he stay on the ticket?
Roosevelt didn't want Wallace on the ticket. Roosevelt wanted to drop him. Roosevelt had gotten to the point where he was fed up with Henry Wallace. Wallace was a classic liberal, and Eleanor Roosevelt loved him. And it's one of the books I read, and I don't remember which one, they said that Franklin Roosevelt once said, well, if Eleanor's for it, I'm against it. And that may not be far from the truth. But he was going to dump Wallace, though he never told Wallace that he wanted to. And that was part of it. So there was going to be a contest for the vice president in 1944, and Roosevelt dragged it along and dragged along different people and misled them and told them, you're still in it and you're still my guy and all. I suggested that he may have had a mental illness, to be honest with you. I've never read that anywhere else, but the way he behaved in the vice presidential contest, which takes up the last chapter in my book, the things he did to people like Jimmy Burns and Alvin Barkley and others that he knew very well, I said that he made Machiavelli look like an amateur.
Wow. Now, Truman was not selected until the convention.
Correct.
Is that correct? And it was called an open convention.
Right.
Now, call me a cynic, but was it truly open? Wasn't this back in the day when conventions were really run in smoke-filled rooms?
This was probably the most open convention there had been in quite a while. Franklin Roosevelt put out a letter which was revealed to the delegates to the Democratic Convention, which took place in July of 1944, in which he said, there are two people that I would really support for vice president, Harry Truman and William O. Douglas, who was a Supreme Court justice at the time. And he said, I would be very comfortable with either one of those on my ticket. He did not do much in the way of helping Truman to gain the vice presidential spot. He didn't oppose him, but he didn't do anything to help him. Even after Truman and Roosevelt had a conversation in which Roosevelt had to talk Truman into agreeing to run for vice president. As I said earlier, Truman kept saying, I don't want to be vice president. I want to stay in the Senate. I can do more good for our war effort in the Senate than I can as vice president. And in a way, he probably was right, although one of the things he did as president, of course, was end the war with Japan by dropping the 2 atomic bombs on Japan.
So who supported Truman? How did they get him to decide to get on the ticket? How did anyone convince Roosevelt to place Truman on the ticket? Wasn't there some maneuvering by some form of political bosses?
It wasn't the political bosses so much as it was Roosevelt's political advisors.
Okay.
He had a cadre of about a dozen men around him, and it was all men, who advised Roosevelt on politics. And every one of them came to the conclusion that Harry Truman was the one man that Roosevelt needed on his ticket. As I mentioned, he was supported by labor, he was supported by the black voters, he was supported by the Jewish vote, and Roosevelt needed all of those votes, remembering that the candidate who was going to run against Roosevelt in 1944 was Thomas E. Dewey, the governor of New York State. Dewey, of course, later ran against Truman in 1948, the very famous campaign there. But in 44, Dewey was a national figure, and they thought he was going to be a real contestant against Roosevelt and whoever Roosevelt ran with. And they thought Truman could bring in votes that nobody else could bring in. So it wasn't so much the political bosses, although they did get behind Truman ultimately, as it was the political advisors to Franklin Roosevelt.
We know they won the campaign, the presidential election in 1944. Once the two of them entered the White House together, what was that relationship like? Now we know famously Truman was kept out of the loop on the Manhattan Project. Yes. Was there still a lack of trust between these two men?
They met a total of 2 times during the 82 days that Truman was the Vice President of the United States, twice in that entire time. And Roosevelt never shared anything with Truman about anything. Roosevelt never shared with him, as you mentioned, about the Manhattan Project, about the atomic bomb. He kept him, Truman didn't find out about that until after he became president. Even as Vice President, he didn't know about it. So I would have to say that the relationship between them was correct, but not warm. And
frosty.
Frosty would be a very good way of putting it. I think that's probably an honest way of putting it. Roosevelt only served as Vice President for 82 days. And during that time, he was never given anything to do. He palled around in the Senate. As the Vice President, he was President of the Senate. And in fact, when Franklin Roosevelt died, Truman was in the Capitol, and he was having bourbon and branch water, as they called it, with Sam Rayburn and a bunch of other members of the House and Senate over in what Rayburn called his Board of Education room. And Harry Truman got a call from the White House saying, you need to come down to the White House immediately, and they didn't tell him why. And Truman, being the proper 1940s man that he was, had left his hat over on the Senate side, so he actually went through the tunnels between the Capitol and the Senate office building and raced underneath there to grab his hat before he just took a taxi down to the White House. He didn't have a security detail. He didn't have anybody with him. It was just Harry Truman going down to the White House where they said, the president has died, and you are now the president.
Unbelievable. How did Harry Truman get along with the Republicans?
He actually got along very well with Republicans. He selected men for his committee who were not crazy anti-New Deal Republicans, but they were staunch Republicans, and they got along so well.
We'll have to wind up. Once again, we must take a short break, and then we'll conclude our final segment. We'll return with more Inside Scoop.
So, I just moved in with his family, and it's embarrassing. The little one, he likes to go outside and crawl around in the giant litter box. I don't know what he's doing. I mean, I was born and I knew how to use the litter box. Look at that. That's disgusting. Oh, poop already. You're making me nervous. Oh, okay, I can't look at this anymore. I really hope he grows out of this, for his sake.
So how was work?
It was 1,300 hours. My math class from 302 was in the trenches. Davy Roth had it the worst. Fractions were coming at him left and right. He just didn't get the damn things. 2 days ago, I tried to teach him what 1/4 of 1/2 was using different sizes of blocks. Yesterday, I tried again by dividing up pizza. Both missions failed.
Oh, no.
But today, I was ready. I created a combat math game where the only way to beat the enemy is to out-fraction them. Davy conquered every last denominator. My game was so successful, the principal is deploying it to math squadrons all over the school. Anywho, how was your day?
Oh, today my boss treated the office to salad wraps.
Salad wraps.
I know.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Let's continue with Dr. James Curry. Don't want to forget the doctor. Author of Missouri Mule, that story of how Harry Truman, our 33rd president, rose to the White House. You were telling me about Harry Truman's relationship with the Republicans. Can you go a little further?
Yes. When Truman was putting together his committee in 1941 after the Senate approved it, interestingly, there were only 16 senators present the day that they approved it, but in the Senate, you assume that there is a quorum present, that is 50 senators plus one, unless somebody suggests there's not. So nobody brought up the topic, so 16 senators established this committee that made all the difference in the war effort and essentially made Truman the president ultimately. But when Truman was selecting the members of his committee, he didn't want people who were what we would call in the Senate show horses. He wanted workhorses. Those are the two distinctions that we staffers made. I don't know whether the members did or not. But he wanted Republicans on his committee who would be willing to work with Democrats toward the end of providing the best possible material for the men and women who were fighting the war in uniform for us, and also who would protect the U.S. taxpayer. It is testimony to the way Truman conducted the committee that the committee issued something like 55 different published reports. There was not a minority report in any one of them. Nobody, that's almost unheard of today. Every report that a Senate committee or House committee issues has a minority view on it. Well, Truman's committee never did that because he allowed Republicans and Democrats alike to edit what they wanted to out of the report that the committee made.
You mentioned Truman only served as vice president for 82 days.
Correct.
Before he had to assume the presidency.
Yes.
Based on your research, was he prepared to be president?
Absolutely. I say that despite the fact that a lot of people might have looked at him at the time and said he's not prepared. And the fact that Truman had this 2.5 years as chairman of the Truman Committee, I think was the biggest preparation he had for becoming president of the United States, because as chairman of that committee, he interacted on a near daily basis with cabinet level officials, frequently with the President of the United States, with the highest ranking members of our military. And Truman had learned as a colonel in the reserves of the Army after the First World War what a military officer can do and what it means to make decisions. And Truman was not afraid to do that. When he had to confront Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War and remove MacArthur from command, a lot of people said, you don't want to do that. It's one of the great generals we've ever had. And Truman said, he's got to go. And he had a sign on his desk, which I'm sure a lot of your viewers will know about, the buck stops here.
We all know that.
And Truman believed in that. He was not afraid to make hard decisions. When he was president, the people came to him immediately and told him about the atomic bomb and said, we developed this weapon so that we don't have to invade the islands of Japan and suffer potentially 1 million casualties on our side. And Truman made what was a very hard decision to drop those 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And some people today criticize that action. I, as a military officer and somebody who studied, do not. But Truman thought it was the right thing to do.
Well, as you said, quite a few very consequential actions took place during Truman's presidency.
Yes.
The Department of Defense was created. The armed forces were desegregated. NATO and the Marshall Plan were established. The United Nations came into being. How consequential was this initially underrated politician from Missouri?
You've just named a number of the things that Truman accomplished as president. And things that maybe today we don't remember that much, but his application of his determination that Western Europe was not going to fall to communism, working with George Marshall, led to the Marshall Plan. It also led to the Truman Doctrine, where we directly supported Western democracies against communists at the time. His desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948, they just 3 years ago, they had a 75th anniversary celebration of that at the Library of Congress and National Archives. I was fortunate enough to attend it, and we had President Truman's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, attended as well. And I can tell you, having been a military officer for 30 years, not only was that the right thing to do, it's the only thing that has allowed the U.S. military to prosper as it has. We were wasting the individuals who were of a different race from the white race when we segregated them and put them in units that did not allow them to realize their full potential. And Truman issued that executive order desegregating the armed forces against the advice of his advisors, who said this is going to cost you votes in the South particularly. And Truman said, I don't care, it's the right thing to do. He recognized the state of Israel 10 minutes after Israel announced its statehood. And when they notified the State Department that he had done that, most of them couldn't believe that he had done it, because George Marshall, who was Secretary of State, opposed it. And Truman did it anyway.
Incredible.
Truman was not afraid to do what he thought was right. He got us into the war with Korea. And I asked people to think about what the world would be like if North Korea had taken over South Korea, considering what a trading partner South Korea is with us today. It wouldn't be the same world. And Truman hated war, but he said that's the right thing to do. And of course, it was a UN action. It wasn't just a UN action. It wasn't just a US action.
Now, you must have had some challenges in researching this book. Can you tell me what were those challenges?
The biggest challenge I faced was COVID-19. I started on this book while I was still teaching at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and I went out to the Truman Library and spent 5 days going through all of Truman's Senate materials that they have on file there. But when I wanted to go to the National Archives, almost the same week that I was determined to go to the National Archives and start going through the Truman papers, I was told we're closing down because of COVID. And I lost 2 years in the process there. That was the main challenge that I faced. As soon as they reopened the National Archives to researchers in the year 2022, I went down there and I spent weeks. And I went through every box of Truman papers, Truman Committee papers the National Archives had that I thought was relevant to telling the story of the Truman Committee. No other historian or political scientist has ever done that. And the things that I have in my book based on that help me flesh out and give nuance to other stories that are similar to the ones that other people have written.
How important was your experience as a Senate staffer to an understanding of how things work in that body, both in the 1940s and even today?
Absolutely essential. There are a number of people who thought that Franklin Roosevelt was afraid of this congressman from Georgia who was proposing this joint committee. And I've got 5 historians, and I'm not going to name them tonight, but who wrote in their books that Franklin Roosevelt was afraid that Goober Cox was going to become the chairman of a committee that was going to be opposing Roosevelt on everything he did. Sam Rayburn was Speaker, and in the House, the Speaker then and now controls what comes to the floor. I mean, it is absolute in the House. Finally, I think what happened, and I say this without having any evidence for it, but I think it's the only explanation. Sam Rayburn went to President Roosevelt and said, Representative Cox is just badgering the goodness out of me to get his resolution on the floor. I've checked with my whips, and he's not going to get anywhere near a majority vote. Let's go ahead and give him a chance to have his vote on the floor of the House. So they finally did, and the vote was 112 for and 252 against. So Cox just got wiped out. But it was the House today and then, and the Senate today and then are fairly much the same. The big difference in the Senate is the way that bills come to the floor. Today it's done by what's called a unanimous consent agreement, which means all 100 senators have to agree to bring it up. Back then you brought it up and then somebody would filibuster. And there were all these notable, famous filibusters by people like Huey Long and others, and Huey Long would read his recipe for pot liquor into the congressional record and entertain the audience by telling stories and everything. Today they don't have that. If they don't have the 60 votes to cut off a filibuster, it doesn't come to the floor.
All right. What do you want readers to take away from Missouri Mule?
I want readers to understand two things. One, if they have a relative who put on a uniform and served our country during World War II, they need to understand that Harry Truman was one man at a high level in the United States government who really cared about the well-being of their ancestors and their relatives. Second, I would like people to understand that Harry Truman was way ahead of his time in terms of working with the press and giving the press what it needed, instead of trying to stifle the press and say, you can't have that, or it's classified, or whatever. Truman told his staffers who worked with the press, unless I tell you otherwise, give them everything they ask for. And those are two things that I think are very important. The third one that I would mention is Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. A lot of people are aware of that. It's a very good book. It's well written, as you might imagine, in which Brokaw talks about how the United States rallied behind the war effort during World War II. Well, my book tells you about the underside of that, the shady side of it, where there were people who were trying to cheat the U.S. government and thereby cheat the war fighters by putting in substandard equipment and agreeing to things that would never hold up today. I don't believe. I hope they wouldn't anyway. And the one example I would use, Standard Oil of New Jersey was the biggest oil company in our country at the time. They signed an agreement with a German firm named IG Farben.
We're going to have to, we don't have the time to go into IG Farben.
Yes.
We're out of time. Let me thank James,
it's in the
Dr.
book.
James Curry, for another enlightening conversation, and I hope you return soon for another edition of Inside Scoop.